Angela Hill, Garland Robinette, Jim Henderson, and meteorologist Dave Barnes. This is Louisiana's news leader, Channel 4's Eyewitness News Night Watch.
Good evening. Arab leaders are converging on Cairo, Egypt tonight.
They're trying to find a diplomatic solution to end the growing crisis in the Persian Gulf. Iraq's President Saddam Hussein is not saying whether he will attend tomorrow's Arab summit. The meeting comes as U.S. forces begin arriving in Saudi Arabia to head off a possible Iraqi invasion. President Bush says economic sanctions designed to force Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait are already having an effect.
There are some indications that he's already beginning to feel the pinch, and nobody can stand up forever to total economic deprivation.
At least one Arab leader, Jordan's King Hussein, says tomorrow's summit is the last chance for a peaceful resolution to the Mideast conflict.
The Chief of Staff for the U.S. Air Force was in New Orleans today to talk about the crisis in the Persian Gulf. General George Dugan says the U.S. force is far superior to anything the Iraqis can put together.
The United States has a very exploitable opportunity, both with naval air and land-based air, because we have a well-trained force. We have a substantial force in terms of numbers. We have good capabilities, and in fact, we can bring to bear more air power than the Iraqis can bring to bear, even close to their home.
Even though the U.S. force is considered superior, President Bush still says the Iraqis have an enormous presence in Kuwait. Iraqi and Kuwait account for 9% of the world's oil supply.
With the pipelines now shut down and the possibility of more military action in the Middle East, Americans are faced with the possibility of an oil and gasoline shortage. That has revived a once familiar concept, conservation. Cheryl Hickman has the story.
Engines rev and cars roar past as thousands of commuters head home from work. But there could be fewer cars and more carpools on the road if drivers heed the words of President Bush.
Conservation measures can also help. Americans everywhere must do their part.
The last time Americans really had to conserve oil and gasoline was back in the 70s. There was a different kind of crisis coming out of the Middle East then. It was the Arab oil embargo. In the 20 years since then, cars have gotten smaller and more efficient, so have air conditioners. But massive government projects to examine energy alternatives were phased out in the 80s as the crisis faded and the nation's thirst for oil increased.
A lot of solar work was done. There was work in shale oil development. There was coal tar sands up in Canada. All of those projects have been stopped. There's almost no research going on except at a few federal labs.
Energy analyst Bill Edson says Americans have become addicted to oil, consuming some 6 billion gallons a year, most of it imported. With a lifestyle now built around cars and convenience, there are limits on where the average consumer can conserve.
I live across the lake in Hammond, and it's pretty rough when you have to go back and forth almost 5 days a week.
The idea of conserving in the areas of heating and cooling. Automobiles are obvious. And the most efficient means of transportation for transporting people is a mass transit approach.
Edson says the oil crisis may seem short-lived now, but it is a long-term problem. He says it will keep coming back to haunt drivers and the entire national economy until America finally breaks its oil habit. Cheryl Hickman, Eyewitness News, Night Watch.
A new Eyewitness News poll shows Bennett Johnston with a solid lead in the U.S. Senate race. The incumbent Democrat racks up 52% of the support of those questioned in the statewide poll. David Duke has 24%, Ben Baggert 9%. John Snell has more on the poll results and reaction.
It isn't every day a senator pays a call.
Bennett Johnston has been all over television lately with an expensive commercial blitz. That could have played a big role in Johnston's rise above the 50% mark.
Johnston right now appears to be hanging on by his fingertips to a first primary victory.
The candidates each put their own spin on the numbers.
I think we're going to win it in the first primary. The polls show that if the election were today, we would win it.
It's showing that my support is increasing, and J. Bennett Johnston's is definitely decreasing, and that people think overwhelmingly that I'm telling it as it is.
The poll of nearly 800 voters statewide shows Johnston leading among both white and black voters, but by radically different margins. 42% of whites questioned favored Johnston, 31% David Duke, 9% Ben Baggert. But among black voters, no contest. Johnston with 80% of the vote. Duke, without the support of the Republican hierarchy, actually leads among GOP voters, 39% to only 16% for Baggert, the endorsed Republican. To make matters worse for Baggert, Democrat Johnston almost doubles Baggert's Republican vote.
Johnston basically used to get all the Republican vote. He was the Republican's senator. Now Duke is getting a big chunk of the real right-wing Republican vote, and that doesn't leave much for Baggert.
Who people support also has a lot to do with how much money they make. Among voters who earn less than $30,000 a year, Johnston builds up a 3-to-1 lead. But Duke has made inroads with more affluent voters. Among those making more than $45,000 a year, Johnston's lead is cut to 15 points.
It used to be basically that if you made over $25,000 a year, you didn't vote for Duke. But in this survey, we see people making over $45,000 a year voting for Duke in significant numbers.
Some observers have said Duke flies under radar. They point out polls last year failed to measure Duke's support when he was elected to the state house. The Duke camp hopes that holds true this time, with the poll showing Johnston within striking distance of a first-round victory. John Snell, Eyewitness News, Night Watch.
Baggert spent the day out of state. His office issued a statement saying his campaign is only just beginning. Baggert noted he has spent only about 1/10 of what his opponents have spent. The poll has an error margin of plus or minus 3.5%.
Still ahead on Night Watch, New Orleans police use a clever disguise to nab a suspected robber tonight.
And breakthrough for people with hip problems. Medical reporter Janet Lawhon will be here with that story.